One of the best things I heard about literature when I was in school was that it's all a conversation, that like we're in conversation with the literature that's come before. And so I think that that's right. Like this is me responding to the story from the particular time and place where I am. But I think no piece of writing or any piece of art is outside of that. So, and I'm sure that's something I think about a lot as a writer actually is like, if I'm so exceedingly lucky that someone still reads one of my books in 100 years' time, I'm sure there will be so many things that they react to in ways I can't even anticipate.
Hey guys, I just wanted to jump in right up top to let you guys know that today's episode does cover a few sensitive topics. The content of Reader, I Murdered Him covers domestic abuse and child abuse. So we don't go into a great deal of discussion on that or go into any details, but we do talk about those topics here. So if that's something that is going to be particularly difficult for you to listen to, you may want to just be careful heading into this episode.
Hello, Lillian.
Hello, Piper.
We have read a fabulous book. I listened to it on tape because I'm a busy bee, but it was
of all the bees I know, you're the busiest.
I'm the busiest, man. I don't have time to climb into a little flower and take a snooze with my butt hanging out like how bees do because they're adorable. But so we read/listened to a fabulous novel, which we're very excited to talk to you guys about today. And that was Reader, I Murdered Him by Betsy Cornwell.
Yes. And we did another cool con, you guys. Just like we've accidentally tricked everyone into listening to this podcast, we also can trick people into being on this podcast. So we had a chance to speak with Betsy earlier today, and we are now recording this timey-wimey, boys, right before you're going to listen to her. But trust me, you're going to want to stick around and listen to it. She had some great things to say. She also has 5 other books that you can go read. They're a little bit more YA than this book. They're all different fairy tales, so different retellings of those with slightly different endings and interpretations than you may expect. If you've read Reader, I Murdered Him, you know that that's her vibe, because this is very much not it is an ode to how much we love Jane Eyre. But it's not for Rochester apologists. If you didn't, let me put it this way. If you didn't like Wide Sargasso Sea because she didn't like Rochester's edit in that, don't read this book. It's not for you.
This one's not for you. If you do like Wide Sargasso Sea, and you also like stories where women take their agency into their own hands and seek revenge in the most glorious fashion, then you should definitely read Reader, I Murdered Him.
If you like books that are good and you don't care how Rochester's portrayed in them, read this book. It's so good.
So yeah, here comes our interview with Betsy Cornwell. Hope you like it. Betsy, the way that we usually kind of open these up whenever we have the pleasure of having a guest such as yourself join us here in the podcast studio, we always like to ask, what was your personal introduction to Jane Eyre? And also, if you happen to have a favorite adaptation, movie, or show, which one is it and why?
Yeah, well, my mother read Jane Eyre to me when I was 10 years old. I was an early reader, which I think is partly because of my mom, who was a literacy coach before she had children, and she really encouraged my love of reading, which I'm very grateful for. But I was terrified of Jane Eyre when she read it to me at 10 years old, and I think like maybe for some kids it would have worked, but I found the whole idea of, Mr. Rochester and the secret wife in the attic really, really scary. And it really resonated with some experiences I had with abuse in childhood, and it really sort of got into my psyche. And Mr. Rochester became this like figure of nightmare and horror for me. And then as I got older, for a lot of my sort of nerdy book friends who I love and respect and think are the smartest people I know, he became their romantic ideal. And so it was really that sort of contrast between my early experience of this character and what my friends were experiencing that made that one of the most formative sort of stories that I encountered growing up. And then, of course, I read Jane Eyre in high school, and then I was an English major, so I read it again in college. I read it again in grad school. I actually took a great class as part of my master's called Jane's Eyres, which is all books inspired by Jane Eyre.
Oh, cool.
It was kind of in that class that I started thinking I wanted to write a story like this, My favorite direct adaptation is probably either 2011 or 2012 with Michael Fassbender and Mia Wasikowska. But from that class, I think one of the books we read was Cold Comfort Farm by Stella Gibbons, which is sort of just kind of a response to Gothic house stories generally, but it's hilarious. It's really, really funny. And that's probably my favorite Jane Eyre inspired work, you know.
We'll have to check that out.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, it's so funny.
For people who don't know, your book really centers around Adele. I'm curious as to how you landed on Adele. And by the way, we're going to do, for our listeners, I'm hoping we mentioned this, but we're not doing spoilers yet. We'll let you know when we're doing spoilers. We get a big, big warning because this book, not that this is a spoiler, there's twists and turns. So
not unlike the source material, it gets you at the end.
Well, that's very flattering. Yeah, if I could say it's like Jane Eyre, then that's a huge compliment. So, yeah, well, let me know if I say anything that's too spoilery, and I will rein myself in, or no, Adele was always. I think Adele stood out to me because she was a child, and I first encountered the story when I was a child. I think my mom read it to me because I was a bookish kid who was getting bullied at school, and she thought that I would relate to the young Jane of the beginning of the book, and it was just one of my mom's favorite books. But Adele was always a really interesting character to me, and I sort of became more interested in her as I got older. And it really, one of the questions that my wonderful teacher in the Jane Eyre's class, her name's Abby Palco, one of the questions she asked was, what kind of mother do you think Jane Eyre is to her children at the end of the book? It always just sort of struck me how Adele kind of vanishes from the story at the end, and actually there's a quote that I pull from and use in Reader, I Murdered Him, which is from Jane's perspective, where she talks about, she goes and gets Adele from this sort of cruel boarding house, similar to the one that she had gone to, boarding school, but then chooses another one to send her to because she says her husband requires all her time and cares. And that made me kind of feel for Adele, because I could only imagine what a lonely childhood she had. And I would have thought that Jane would have recognized that and it would have drawn them together, but it doesn't really seem like that's what happens. And so I was really interested in exploring Adele's experience because of that.
Just as you were kind of talking about that, it makes me think about how, first of all, I think Lillian and I are always very excited in an adaptation when we see Adele at the end with the family in that kind of little happily ever after, if we get that moment. Yeah. So that's always like, hooray, they didn't forget about her. But when you think about like the context of the actual novel itself, it's so interesting to me to think about how, like, for the most part, Adele is so alone. Like, she's just like in this big empty house in a foreign country, apart from having her, like the woman who's helping to take care of her, and then also Jane. But then in your story, there's so many moments where she's brought into these different kind of little communities of other girls and women. Yeah. And that's something that Lillian and I talk a lot about the significance of Jane's journey, of how she grows when she's in communities with other women. Is that something that you can like kind of talk about, of like how you adapted her character in those ways?
That like gave me chills a little bit. That's totally, that's been so central to the way I think about this story. So I went to a women's college. I went to Smith in Western Massachusetts, and it was totally so life-changing for me to be in this community centered around women. And so Adele's experience at boarding school in Reader, I Murdered Him is totally a reflection of the community of women that I found at Smith, and that I'm so grateful for, and that I still benefit from hugely from being part of that like alumni network. And as someone who had a difficult childhood, a difficult sort of family of origin experience, found family is a huge theme in all of my books, but I think especially in this one, I was really interested in the kinds of community and protection and sort of social insurance that women can offer to each other, especially in a world where they're in danger. And that's the world of the 1800s, and it's also the world of today. So that's something that was really close to my heart, and I'm so glad that came through.
No, you wrote it beautifully. I liked how often Adele thought back to her time in France, the house or the place where she grew up with her mother, and thinking about how those women operated and made their way through the world, and then taking those kind of harder, more realistic lessons of like what things are actually like versus what they like tell, proper young ladies to believe that the world is like. Yeah. I liked how often she thought back on that. She's like, I know better. I've seen this. And that was very interesting. Yeah. I thought you did that great.
Thank you. Well, it's interesting to me also how Adele's mother is viewed in Jane Eyre, because like it's there's a lot of sort of moral judgment of, I mean, it's never totally clear. It's like, is she a sex worker? Is she a dancer or whatever? There's a lot of like the commodification of women's bodies is something that is a through line, I think, in both of those scenarios. You have women who, are sex workers, or you have women who are in high society and trying to make a good match, both sort of selling their access to their femininity in exchange for money. And, I think Adele would be perfectly positioned to see those parallels in a way that sort of high society women wouldn't want to acknowledge is there, so.
It felt very much like she had this extra layer of understanding that made her see what was actually happening in a way these other girls couldn't. And I don't want to go too much into spoiler territory here, but I think it's just so related to what you're talking about here. It seems very clear to me in this that she is safer than these other girls from this very seemingly unsafe. In sheltering these girls and trying to keep them safe, they actually send them into incredibly dangerous situations without an understanding of what that means. And I'm curious as to kind of how you chose to balance that out.
That's a really good way to put it. I think like Adele grew up, in this world where she was learning a lot about what men want from women, and that gives her kind of a jaded perspective in a way. But it allows her to see the men around her more clearly, because she would have seen them like purchasing services from her mother and her friends, and her society friends, and even Jane like wouldn't have really encountered that or like been able to conceptualize of it in a sort of real way. And so I think that, right, without getting too spoilery, like that gives her a different perspective on the men that she knows than a woman who hasn't had that experience would have. And it allows her to be safer, but it also, it does mean that her relationship with those men isn't as trusting as it might be, and that leads her to have some loneliness, I think. And makes her very protective of other girls. And that was something like I also wanted to push back against the idea of sort of like a mean girl school narrative or anything like that, where like the girls are out to get each other or are competing for men. That hasn't been my experience, or at least the vast majority of my experience in the world. And I've been really lucky to find communities of women that do, want to protect each other. And so that was just Adele brings a certain experience and a certain skill set to that, and other girls would have different things, so.
Absolutely. No, that was definitely refreshing to have, not just like girls against girls, but girls as allies for fellow girls. So
for sure.
And of course that happens in Jane too. Like we have Helen Burns at the boarding school, and that's a really beautiful depiction of friendships. So.
Well, I have a bunch of spoily questions, and I know Piper has some questions a little bit more about your sort of writing process and pieces around that. So maybe we should go into that before I spoil it for everyone. Yes.
Before we dive into the mind-blowing endings of this story, I just would love to know a bit more about kind of your creative process of this. Always want to know when, writing historical fiction, I'm always curious to know what your approach, first of all, was to researching for this novel. And I think particularly what I'm curious about is what kind of research did you do to kind of look into the different kind of approaches to different societal norms and expectations, I think, is something that I'm very curious.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think the historical research is something that I have a little bit of an inferiority complex about, because I always feel like I should have done more, And I think in every one of I have 5 books that I published before this one, and they're all essentially fairy tale retellings. And so I approached this book in the same way that I would the retelling of Cinderella that I did, for instance, where it's a classic text, it's sort of part of the collective consciousness in a way, really. And it's a story that affected me a lot as I was growing up and that I want to have a conversation with. So it's, it's me engaging with a tale, but I sort of thought of Jane Eyre as like a myth or a fairy tale almost, that's how I approached it. That's why I wanted to write about it. That's the kind of space it takes up in my head. And I had never written historical fiction before. And I kind of was terrified. Now I read a lot of historical fiction and I really enjoy it. Like I read, I've grew up reading Regency romance novels, which certainly were an influence on this book. I read a lot of historical fiction and watch a lot of period dramas and all of that. And so I think I had been steeped in I knew a little bit about how to talk about clothes and food and that kind of thing. I did a lot of reading about London boarding schools in the early 1800s. That was something that was really interesting to me. But I tried to have a light touch with historical detail because I was really nervous that I was just going to get it wrong. And I think that it also was just not something that was the center of my interest in the story artistically. And that's not to denigrate that. Like I said, I feel kind of inferior about it. I have a huge amount of respect for people who can do that really rigorous research, but it just wasn't where the heart of this story was for me. And so I wanted it to be, I approached it in the way you would a fairy tale, kind of,
No, I love that, because I think that's another thing that Lillian and I talk about a lot is what the original intention of the novel was, how that audience at the time was reading it and interpreting it versus like a modern audience today, which will see it very differently. And so when seeing, the different kind of the way that Adele especially kind of navigates these social interactions, written from like a modern author and then read by a modern audience, I'm always so curious to be like, oh, I wonder what someone from that time period would think
Absolutely.
of like how these interactions are going on. I thought it came across wonderfully, and
Thank you.
Definitely can see all the beautiful Regency influence. So
yeah, it gives it almost a timeless quality.
Oh, thank you. I don't know what someone in the 1800s would think.
Give us an answer right now, Betsy.
Yeah, no, that's kind of a terrifying thought. I hadn't thought about that. It's like, oh God, I'm sure they would be disgusted. But
I don't know that we care what they think.
No.
But we're writing for right. Well, right. I mean, one of the best things I heard about literature when I was in school was that it's all a conversation, that like we're in conversation with the literature that's come before. And so I think that that's right. Like this is me responding to the story from the particular time and place where I am. But I think, right, no piece of writing or any piece of art is outside of that. So, and I'm sure that's something I think about a lot as a writer actually is like, right. Like if I'm so exceedingly lucky that someone still reads one of my books in 100 years time, I'm sure there will be so many things that they react to in ways I can't even anticipate,
Absolutely. So. Well, lucky for you. You've got copies that'll last forever.
That's right.
So. My last logistical question that I'm just kind of curious about. So I listened to the audiobook of this because I had multitasking things, but I was so curious to know, were you part of the approval process for the actress that they chose to narrate the book? And if so, what was that like? Yes,
that's a really interesting process for me. So I have some audio processing issues. So I actually don't listen to a lot of audiobooks or podcasts. And so I said that to my publisher, and that I wanted to give precedent to people who know what they're doing more than I do. But they did send me 2 sort of audition clips from 2 different narrators. And I just really liked the tone that the narrator that we ended up going with had. She had this sort of richness to her voice. And she also is a French woman. And so she had a real French accent, which I think is really cool. And that was an early question that the audiobook publisher asked me was like, do we want to narrate in a French accent? And that actually, I was really glad that I got that question before the final copies of the book went to print, because it made me think about how Adele would speak in more depth than I had thought about before. And I said, actually, I think she would intentionally hold on to a bit of a French accent because her French identity is so important to her. And, because she's sort of this idea of embodying her mother is important to her. And so I think she wouldn't. And also, I'm an American, but I've lived in Ireland for 10 years. And so I have a sort of complicated relationship with how I speak, and so I think it was an interesting thing to think about, and I really like the narrator that they chose. I think she did a great job.
That's awesome. Yeah, her voice was stunning. I love what you said too about how that element of the process kind of influenced your thought on writing the story and kind of like how it would be read, from Adele's voice. So that's very cool to see that kind of come around. But thank you for sharing that. I was so curious.
Okay, I think maybe we should talk spoilers because I have so many questions and I'm so excited to talk to you. So,
cool.
Take it away.
Ladies and single gentlemen who listen to this podcast, please, this is your time. go read this book. Trust me, you're going to love it. Or maybe you'll hate it and I'll still find it fun that you hated it. But there are real spoilers and this is your chance to leave. Get out right now. I'm not kidding. Go read the book, come back. Okay. How was your experience? What did you think? Tell us everything. So I have so many specific questions, but I really want to start with the obvious, which is this is not for Rochester apologists.
No.
I really want to know, kind of, you alluded to this when you talked about your experience of reading the book when you were a child. And I'm curious as to, you have painted Rochester as a very spooky villain.
Yeah.
And I'm curious as to kind of what the goal was there and what your inspiration behind that was there.
Yeah, frankly, it was personal catharsis. Like, it was really good for me to kill him so bad, you know. I remember I was sitting in this very cute little girly frilly lacy tea house in Galway here in Ireland, and I got some rose petal tea and I like sat there and I murdered him, and it was very satisfying. And I think it was this like this fear that I'd had of him since I was 10, and it's wrapped up for me in, you know, unfortunately the real life experiences of abuse that I've had. And so it was very empowering to write that scene. And I think that's why I went to get like full spoilers, but I kind of killed him in multiple ways. Like, he swallows the poison ring and he like falls out the, you know, there's so like he is killed real dead. And so that I really, you know, it was sort of personal for me, I think. And so and I knew, like, again, many of the smartest people I know, he's like their all-time book boyfriend. And I'm not saying I'm right and they're wrong. Like, that's really important to me. And I had more writer's block for this book than any other book I've written, I think, because I felt so uppity. I was like, who am I to do this, to say this? And I mean, you know, but I think I'm not trying to say, you know, Bronte was wrong or anything like that. It's, you know, obviously a work of genius. But again, it goes back to that idea of the conversation. And this was a conversation that I needed to have with this book. And I'm very lucky that a publisher platformed it for me. You know what I mean? So, and I've received messages from readers who have said that it was cathartic for them as well. And so that means a lot to me, you know, and I know it's not for everybody, and that's okay, but it is something that I needed to do for myself, I think, you know.
Did you have, so what you just said about your publisher, was there at any point, like when you went to them with this and they saw how it ended and what you did with Rochester, was there kind of any like pushback or caution to be like, okay, this is a beloved character, like, are you sure you're going to do this? And you're like, absolutely, no backing down.
Well, interestingly, there was no pushback about Rochester, but they did say, so I wrote this book, you know, all my books have been with the same publisher. I'm very lucky to have the same editor who's great, and she has a lot of trust in me, and I can sell books on proposal now, which means I write this like document that's a few pages long and they'll say, go for it, you know. But with this one, she took it to the publishers. They said they wouldn't publish it unless I put in one good man, that there were no good men in this book. And my editor, sorry, I hear my tone, how I felt about that. Like, my editor came back to me and she was like, I'm so sorry, we have to put in a good man. And I was so angry because there are good men in all my other books, and I didn't even do that on purpose. It just, like, you know, for all my feminist rage, that is actually part of my worldview. Like, it just, you know, I wrote good male characters in my other 5 books without trying to, because that is in fact part of how I imagine the world, like, believe it or not. And so I was like, why does there have to be, like, you know, why can't we just have this one thing? And they also said they didn't want her to commit more murders than necessary. And so
they're very necessary murders that
like,
she commits.
Right.
So.
The ones that are there are necessary. And so that's like, I had to, like, you know, and I mean, maybe like I hadn't written the full scenes by then. And looking back, I wonder if Rochester is as nightmarish as he is in that ending scene, because I was like, this needs to be extremely clear that, like, she has to kill him, you know. But it also, I think that was how I imagined I don't know, maybe that influenced that. And but yeah, she was going to have a lot more murders. She was going to like ride around England murdering Gothic heroes. That was my vision, and like
Cool.
I would read that sequel.
I think but like, so then it's like she doesn't kill, like it's kind of toned down from that. And but then I have seen some reviews from readers where they wish it was more vicious, and that kind of makes me think, oh, what might have been, but like I also, like, I'm a single parent, and I was making a living as a writer by the time I became a single parent. And so I think I wrote the book that I needed to write in order to live. And I think that that's something that certainly the Brontes would understand, and that and that I'm proud of. So, I said, right, we'll have one good man, and that ends up being Nan's father, Peter Ward, who runs the pub. And then very close to the final printing, I had the sort of brainwave that he could be a trans man. And I was like, oh, that makes it so much better. And so then I didn't really have time to do anything with that, but I put in a few little things from which you could deduce that he might be a trans man. So I wish I'd had more time to deal with that, but that made me happy anyway. So
yeah, there's so many little things that kind of feed into the larger story here. Like, I was totally with Adele on her weird vibe with Rochester, but like did not see coming, despite the fact that it's called Reader, I Murdered Him, and it's a very like should be obvious where it's going. Like, I did not see it coming.
I'm glad, because I mean, I do kind of tell you what's going to happen in the title. Yeah. So,
yeah. Cause there's so many things in looking back at it that you're like, oh, she told me here, and she told me here, and she told me here. And I'm curious about how that experience was like seeding that, because you knew, and I've always wondered about like balancing that out. Like when she gets the portrait and she looks at it and goes, that looks a lot like...
That one I was like, maybe that's too much, but right. Like, yeah. I mean, I think the thing is with like, one of the ways that I've heard writing a book described is like, which is actually inappropriate for doing a 18th century sort of thing, is like a piece of embroidery. And if you're making it, you can see all the knots and all the threads together on the back, and so then it seems really obvious to you. But then if the reader is just looking at the front, so they can't see those connections in the same way you can. And that's comforting, And I think I've had the experience, like I said, this is my 6th book, and I've had the experience with previous books of things that I thought were embarrassingly obvious not coming through. And on the other hand, things that either I thought were really subtle and people were like, oh, that was so predictable, or things that I genuinely didn't even consciously think of that people draw really cool connections between in my books. And I love that. I think that's really cool. But so I'm really glad to hear that the twist worked for you, because right, you never know, and but it was also like the twist was the point for me. Like that was what the book was about. So I always knew that it was going to be there. But the other nice thing about foreshadowing is you can write it after your first draft, which makes it way easier. Like, once you've already written a draft of the book, you can go back and put things in.
The one that gave me the ick from the beginning that really came through at the end was the fact that he also calls her elf, like an elf. I was like, I don't like that he's calling her the same name he calls Jane. That's very icky to me. And then at the end you get the why, and I'm like, no.
Yep. Yeah, so the elf thing always icked me in Jane Eyre too, to be like, I felt like it was him not seeing her as a human being, which, like, I mean, I know, again, that's a controversial take, right? Like, even at the end when she comes back to him after the fire and stuff, he thinks she's an apparition. I think he like puts her on a pedestal in a way. And I know I also trained as a rape crisis counselor when I was in college, and I had this experience of childhood abuse and also domestic abuse, unfortunately, and so I learned a lot about the cycle of abuse. And that's something that I felt really clearly looking at Rochester's 2 marriages in the source text. Like, there's this idealization of the partner that then gets destroyed, and I know from experience, unfortunately, that it's really hard to break those cycles. And like, so it made sense to me that maybe, and this is the thing about the dream of romance, is you want to believe it'll be different for you, right? But these cycles are really hard to break. And so I think it made sense to me that he would be going through the same cycle repeatedly with different women.
what I just like thought of with you saying that, when Lillian and I talk about what we refer to as the stay speech in the original novel, when he like explains everything and tries to convince Jane not to leave, that was like, we had a whole episode just on that chapter and just kind of discussing that. And we ended that episode by saying, would you stay or would you go if you were in that situation? And what you talked about with the cycles there, the main reason why I couldn't stay with him is because not only the reveal of Bertha, but it's the way that he talks about the other women. Like, he's like, oh yeah, I went to like this mistress and this mistress and this mistress, and they were all pieces of trash.
Yeah.
But it's like, but he lays all that out and he's honest about that. But then he says to Jane right afterwards, he's like, but you're different. I'm not going to do that to you. And it's like, how could you believe that after you have the evidence in front of you?
Totally. And he's already indicated with his dishonesty that she's not different to him, you know? And I think, and in fairness to Jane, she does leave, right? Like she is like, this is a deal breaker. I'm out, you know? So I think, and I also, you know, I was thinking, I mean, I watched a lot of adaptations since I was writing this, and the one from, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on names, so I shouldn't even be referencing this, but it was like a BBC miniseries from the 70s or early 80s, and it had one of the James Bonds as Rochester. I really liked.
That's my favorite one.
It's so good.
With Timmy D.
It's so good.
Timothy Dalton.
Yes, Timothy Dalton. Thank you. I was blanking. Anyway, I really liked the ending of that one, and it got this feeling of grace across to me, that like they come back together because of the grace that they have for each other, and that is incredibly romantic. And like they are these deeply flawed people who come back together through grace and forgiveness, and lovely, beautiful, love it. I still hate him, but like I think that's beautiful, you know. Yes. And, there's also like Jane Eyre is so young, she's what, 20 in the story or something, and you know, I mean
18 or 19,
right, and he's not, you know, and and is also a very powerful man. And yeah, it's just, and so, you know, a lot of this resonates personally for me with my dad, and also my ex-husband, who was 10 years older than me and told me a lot of things that turned out not to be true. And so I think I think a lot of women, as they get older, see these things happening for younger women over and over again, and it kills you not to be able to say, don't you know what's going to happen? But then but you can't, like, there's no older woman could have told me not to marry my husband. Like, it just wouldn't have happened, because I was on this narrative of romantic fantasy, you know, and it's so powerful. Like, you know, I've always been a feminist, and I always like to think that my critical faculties kept me from sort of buying into the romantic fantasy that we're fed by the media. But there's no way to not internalize some of that stuff. And so I think, like stories teach us to forgive men for hurting us, and that teach us over and over again that is the way that you show your love to a man, is by forgiving him for hurting you. And like, I'm getting pretty sick of it, you know?
Yeah.
So.
We should kill him.
This is a bigger question, so take your time to answer if you want. But given what you just said about that, about, you know, what you want to like give to like other generations of women, what is kind of a big takeaway that you want, especially female readers, to take away from reading your book?
Ooh, that's a great question. I mean, hearing from other readers that they found the book cathartic, is the word I'll come back to again, is really good for me, is something that makes me really happy. Or, you know, just to let those two different takes on who Jane and Rochester exist in the mind at the same time is a good thing. But I think the answer that I'd really give for that is a similar answer to what I would hope people would take away from my body of work generally, which is, because, you know, my other books are for young adults and are fairy tale retellings. And so it's kind of a more expansive concept of what a happy ending can be, which is sort of related to, this idea of like, what is love for women, and what is happiness for women. And most of my books have sort of non-traditional happy endings in one way or another. And so I do make a point of Adele saying she could have married Nan, which, I mean, who knows how historically accurate this is, but again, it's a fairy tale, whatever. But like, but that they're not the marrying kind. They choose to have a different kind of life. Just this idea that the happiness that she finds is through something unconventional. I guess that's the sort of larger takeaway that I would hope to offer readers from all my work, really. Yeah.
I'm so obsessed. My queer little heart loved your little queer haven that you created. I just adored that. As somebody who reads a lot of period dramas and Regency romances and relatively recently came out, there's something about reading about the idea of these happy little queers all tucked away in their corner of this pub. And I'm curious as to where the inspiration came for that.
Yeah, that is actually the thing that I wish I'd had more time to expand on. So again, like I said, I write for a living and I write to deadline, so it is what it is. But that is the thing that I wish I could have spent more time on. And it came fairly late to the story and then seemed so obvious that I was kind of kicking myself for not including it earlier on. And the reason is that sense of community that we were talking about earlier, that like it's so central to like the queer experience is like sure, it's about sexuality, but it's about community, like, you know. And so I think and that's why, like, right, I mean, I'm bisexual. My dating history is mostly with men, for better or for worse. And like, but I think but the queer community is about so much more than that. It's, you know, it is in the same way that I was talking about Adele and her community of the other girls. It's about, you know, safety and solidarity and empowerment and all of those things. And so I didn't want her queer relationship with Nan to exist in a vacuum. And I also, like, if Nan was going to be more confident about this aspect of herself, where would that have come from if not from this experience of community? Mm-hmm. And I always did have Adele, like, I envisioned the place where she grew up with her mother as this kind of progressive haven in its way as well, and that there would have been, like, some of the dancers might have had relationships with each other and that kind of thing. And so it wasn't totally foreign. The concept of two women together wasn't totally foreign to Adele. Yeah, like that is the thing that I wish I'd put in more. So I'm glad that you liked what was there. So yeah.
It made me very happy. But I think the other piece that is sort of not related to the queerness, but related to sort of a kind view in a space where you could have taken a less than kind view is Jane gets a real good edit in this book. And I'm curious as to what the motivation was there and your perspective on Jane combined with this very extreme and possibly accurate view of Rochester.
Yeah, that's something that I feel like I have no doubt that you two both are more knowledgeable about Jane as a character than I am. So I say everything that I'm about to say with a huge grain of salt. But again, I think it comes back to me responding to my own emotional history with the book. And both Jane and Rochester are so wrapped up with my idea of who my parents are that really influenced how I read the character. And also, like, when my teacher, Abby, asked what kind of mother Jane would be, I had this sort of resistant reaction to it because Abby argued that she thought Jane would be the most fabulous mother because she knew how it is to be neglected and that she would be so warm and so caring and so kind. But, like, you do see this weird judgment of Adele in the text, and that is kind of slut-shamey and kind of just alienating, maybe. And it made me really feel for Adele. And also, like, right, how does Jane view Bertha? How does Jane excuse what happens to Bertha? And also, I think, but I wanted Jane to be an intelligent and caring person who still gets wrapped up in this cycle of abuse, because I think it can happen to intelligent and caring people. And it is in part that she is so insightful and so caring that she loves Rochester so much. But that doesn't mean that she's not being manipulated. Like, I think people have this idea that women who get manipulated or who get abused are stupid or are weak-willed or something like that. And it's not the case. And so I didn't want that to be a poor reflection on Jane. I think I certainly, again, this is an incredibly iconic character, a blueprint for many feminist characters. And I fully think this is a work of genius. But it is sort of, again, it comes from a sort of my long personal emotional history with the book that I think that this is the response that I had. And I think also, like, because Jane is so... she's such a strong character, but she's a side character in this book, that, like, in order for her to not sort of take over as heroine, certain things had to happen, you know? So
I think the biggest thing left that I wanted to chat with you about is Bertha. So twofold to that question. The first one is her sort of presence at the beginning of the book and that influence on Adele that we sort of feel through the rest of the book. But the second one, and you can start with this if you want, did Rochester kill Bertha? Is that what you're, because reading this book, I was like, did he do that? Did he do that murder?
Good question. I wanted that to be kind of like, I think that couldn't be super clear because then it would make it pretty clear what kind of person he was way before. Like, and also I think Adele wouldn't know. If Adele was like, how much would she know about what was going on? I kind of think, yeah, in my mind he did in this iteration of it. But I did kind of want there to be space for multiple interpretations of that, because I also did like, I think it's kind of, it would have been patronizing to say, oh, Bertha's harmless, right? Like that would be kind of a shitty take too. Like, I mean, depending on how you characterize her, but like, if she's like, you know, whatever. I love Bertha. So I think I wanted her to be complicated, you know, and I think I didn't want her to be just like a lost child or something like that. And so, I do really love the gothic and I love the spookiness. So I wanted there to be that unsettling, unearthly quality to, especially Adele's time at Thornfield. So I think Adele sees Bertha Bertha is becomes one of the major psychological female figures in her life. She has like her mother and Bertha and Jane, and they're all kind of versions of the same, like they're all weird mirrors of each other, which I think is true in Jane Eyre as well. Like, you know, I mean, lots of people could argue that Bertha is Jane's shadow self or whatever. And so I think they're all these sort of possibilities of what womanhood is that she's sort of trying to interpret and navigate. And she also recognized, like, I think she feels an affinity with Bertha because she's also from another country and she's also sort of being held captive in a very different way. And Bertha's the one who says at the beginning of the book, he is going to put us all on the same shelf by the end, you know? So, and she's right. Yeah.
No, another great example of those kind of like little clues placed early on in the story to kind of lead us where we were going to go. I liked again how often she would think back on, because I think you did like kind of draw that out specifically in the book of Adele reflecting on the significance of the three women as she was growing up. And it was so interesting in the moment, for example, when she's first away at like that one bad boarding school or whatever, and the fact that she was used to this insane woman coming into her room at night and it scared her, but like she didn't hurt her in that way. And the way she compared that to a man coming into the room at night and what those two different horrors mean against one another, like, amazing. So, but very, very interesting to see the parallels there.
Yeah, like what is safety, and you know, but like because she's so young, like she wouldn't necessarily, like she would interpret that differently. I think there's so many, like I have a 6-year-old now, and I have thought a lot about lately how everything seems normal when you're a kid. If you have some experience, you're just like, oh yeah, that's how it is, and then maybe you grow up and you think, oh my god, like what was going on, you know? So
I think that's our questions.
Yeah.
Betsy, do you have anything else about your story or this process or the source material or the community around these characters? Anything else that you just need to share before we wrap up?
Oh gosh. No, this has been such a really fun conversation to have. Thank you so much. I'm really so glad that I've gotten to chat about these things with you guys. And thank you for your having such smart responses and readings of the book. It really means a lot to me. Yeah, I mean, I'm very grateful to my teacher, Abby Palco, who taught that Jane Eyre's class. That was a huge reason why this book exists. And funnily enough, she was actually my first creative writing teacher ever when I was 13 years old at a summer camp that I went to. And then it just so happened that she was a professor in my grad school, and I took the Jane Eyre class with her. So it all seems very like fated somehow or something, but she's the best. And I think she's going to listen to this. So I just wanted to shout out to Abby. And I think also, yeah, like the other, I think the other books and just other stories that respond to Jane Eyre are so wonderful. It's clearly such an infinitely rich text that has like given rise to so many wonderful stories. Actually, my favorite novel of all time, I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith, is I think owes a debt to Jane Eyre as well. And it's remarkable how it's persisted through the ages. And so I really enjoyed getting to play with it. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Yes. And now you are part of that conversation. So
yeah,
and it has been
awesome.
such a pleasure to have this conversation here with you today. So Betsy, thank you so much for giving us some of your time and your insight and writing the story and letting us talk about it with you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been a blast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This really has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Oh my gosh, you guys. Okay, so that was just a blast. She is the best. So sweet. It was awesome to have those conversations, to see both into both the writing process, the publishing process. Also really cool to, like, just in my personal experience, speak to someone who is like a contracted writer. That, like, I mean, first of all, Betsy, you did it. You are at a point now where you can write a 1-page description of a story and they're like, have at it. We trust you. Here's some money. Write a book. Amazing. Jealous. So incredible experience to talk with her today.
Yeah. And I think what we all learned, and it's the moral we should take away from this story, is murder's fine. That's what Betsy said. Betsy said murder is a fine thing to do. And we should do murders.
Yeah, they included that in the quote on the cover of the back dust jacket of the, like, do a murder. It's cool, said, quote, Betsy Cornwell, author of this book.
Co-signed Lillian Potter, host of Airbuds.
From current Lillian of past Lillian and Piper.
Asterisk, Piper slinks away without comment.
I just want to explicitly say here,
comment on
in
whether or
real
not
life,
she was
we're
pro-murder.
very anti-murder.
And we think that stance is weak,
very
either
anti-murder.
or against it,
you
Piper.
just super loopy after recording for a long
deflecting.
time. So just want to explicitly say that no one is pro-murder who has been or will ever be on this podcast. Second thing, Betsy reached out to us after we recorded this episode and wanted us to let you guys know that there is one additional adaptation that is actually her favorite adaptation of Jane Eyre. She loves the 2011, but her favorite is actually the National Theatre production, which is also a favorite of this program. With that, I'll give it back to Loopy, Piper, and Lillian.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please let us know. You can interact with us in all kinds of forms. We are on social at Airbuds. You can send us lengthy emails about why you love this or why you hated it, because we want to talk to you about both reasons. Airbuds@gmail.com. If you got $3, because everyone's got at least $3, give them to us.
If you don't have $3, don't feel pressured.
Then you don't need to give us your only $3. But if you have more than $3, give us.
If you have three like extra
dollars.
ones,
because we have a Patreon and there's cool things on there, like a very dramatic NPR style radio.
It's so good, boys and girls. We haven't, because of how we're recording this summer, we haven't had a chance to talk about it too much. It's so good. It made me so happy. If you leave this and you need a little bit of a balm of like me, I hate Rochester so much and I need something to get me back into him and feel sympathetic for him again. That's a very generous read of Rochester. Poor sweet boy Rochester's tough life.
Yes, this is my Rochester playlist, my mood board. I have selected, I believe it's 8 or 9 songs that represent his life and his story, and I give you little kind of narrative journeys throughout each one. So check that out. You can get it for $3 on Patreon. It's a blast, and we'd just love to have your support.
And just as a reminder, we are on summer hours. So 2 weeks from when you're listening to this, actually on my brother's birthday, happy birthday, Rob. Holly, when you listen to this, tell Rob I said happy birthday. This is the only way I'm wishing him happy birthday this year.
Happy birthday!
It's 2 weeks from today on August 21st. We are going to be doing another palette cleanser. And as you may know, because it may already have been a survey that we did, but we are recording these out of order, so we don't know yet which one we're going to watch. We're watching Wuthering Heights. And we don't know which adaptation yet. Please vote for the best one. We want to watch one that's good. That's why we're asking you.
Yeah. And remember, if it's the one with Timmy D, I will become biased and there will be no changing my mind from that point on. So if you don't want to influence me, maybe don't pick that one.
You may have already picked already, and this is sounding very weird to you.
Oh my gosh.
On that note, anyway, get out of here.
Goodbye. See you later.
You're not going to say the whole thing.
Oh, okay, fine. Happy Jane Eyre reading and watching GTFO.
Bye.